Well, hello, my name is Sue Ann Tom, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Whitman Public Library. So, welcome to our author talk for Not So Elementary, My Dear Watson, with Dr. Ann McClellan, who you've already met. We have a really great program for you tonight. And so there's some housekeeping to begin with. And so thank you, first of all, to the Friends of the Whitman Public Library for making all of this possible. And all of the participants will be muted throughout all of this. I will be moderating to help monitor questions that are going to come along later on. But if any of you have experienced technical difficulties, I want you to go ahead and just send me a message in the chat. And you've already been great about that. So that's fantastic. And what would a Sherlock talk be without a Watson? My co-host tonight is Paul Watson from Whitman Hanson Community Access, who is working on sound and technology. And again, questions and answers for the speaker are going to come later on in the evening. So if you want to go ahead and throw those into the chat too, I'll be monitoring those. And now let's welcome Dr. Ann McClellan, who is an associate professor of English at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire, who has lectured and researched and published on the topic for this evening. Welcome, Ann. We are so excited to have you. It's fantastic. We have a really big group tonight. There are going to be 100 people have signed up, almost 100 people have signed up for this, which probably does not surprise you, given the popularity of this topic. So tell us, what is this about? What's the popularity about?
Thank you, Sue Ann. Thank you so much for the invitation for the Whitman Public Library. So welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm going to take a couple seconds here and I'm going to share my screen because I know it's very helpful in any kind of presentation where somebody's talking for a little while for you to have something to look at besides little boxes on your screen. So just give me 1 second here and I'll go ahead and share my screen and get us going. So close your eyes until I can get this running for you. There we go. So as Sue Ann introduced, we're going to be talking this evening a little bit about the popularity of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the most popular and most portrayed fictional character of all time, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. There have been more fictional portrayals of him on screen, on television, and film than any other literary character of all time. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a little bit of the history behind the character, some of the cultural and historical factors that contributed to his popularity, and some of the ways that he's evolved through popular culture over the last 135 years. So if I was going to show anyone pretty much any one of these items, they would know exactly who we are talking about. Sherlock Holmes is the most popular fictional character of all time, and he has had numerous incarnations. So many of you who may have been listening in the webinar as we were getting started, we were even talking about how many new versions are coming on television and film just in the last year, let alone the last decade. So we're going to talk a little bit about his popularity and try to tease out what are some of the reasons behind it. So let's start at the top. So Arthur Conan Doyle is the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. He was born in 1859 in Edinburgh, Scotland, to a mostly middle to upper middle class family. His father was a successful illustrator, but unfortunately he suffered from alcoholism and actually had to be institutionalized during Doyle's lifetime due to his addiction. And it was really thanks to his uncle that he was able to get the education that he accomplished through his lifetime. So he graduated with a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh Medical School in 1881, and like many of recent college graduates, decided he wanted to have a few adventures before he settled down to work for a living. So after he graduated, he signed up to work as a ship surgeon, and he sailed to the Arctic in 1881, and he enjoyed that trip so much that as soon as he got back, he actually signed up on another ship and sailed down to the west coast of Africa, where he actually did some amazing work on photography, published his photographs in the British Journal of Photography once he returned. And he finally came back and settled down in the south of England, in the Portsmouth area specifically, and opened his first medical practice. Now, lucky for us, but maybe a little unlucky for him, he wasn't a very good doctor. He couldn't get any patients, so he found himself with these new examination rooms, and he had no way to make any money. So he decided to pick up a hobby that he had developed while he was at university and see if he could write some short stories and publish them to get a little extra cash. And this is, of course, where he creates the character of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. Now, he published 56 stories and 4 novellas about Holmes and Watson over his lifetime, but most people don't know he also authored more than 20 other original novels. He wrote historical fiction. He actually really wanted to be known as a serious historical novelist, but he also wrote adventure novels with a character named Professor Challenger, the most famous of which many of you may know, was actually The Lost World, which Michael Crichton, of course, adapted into the sequel for Jurassic Park. And he published more than 100 other short stories over his lifetime before he died in 1930 of a heart attack. At the time of Conan Doyle's death, he was the highest paid writer in the entire world, thanks to the success of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, a question I get quite a bit is, was Sherlock Holmes based on a real person? And the question is a little bit no and a little bit yes. No, because Doyle himself during his lifetime proclaimed that he was a big fan of the American author Edgar Allan Poe. And he said that he came up with part of his idea for Sherlock Holmes after reading Edgar Allan Poe's short stories like Murder in the Rue Morgue with his detective Auguste Dupin. But he also said he based quite a bit of Sherlock Holmes on one of his real-life professors in medical school, Dr. Joseph Bell. He was a really well-known, charismatic lecturer in the medical school who was famous for being able to bring patients in off the street, and he could diagnose them without the patients telling anything that was wrong with them. He would just use his observation skills, look at their body, kind of read their muscles, and he could diagnose and tell them what was wrong with them. Now, Doyle worked for Joseph Bell, served as a clerk when he was there in medical school, and he was really amazed by this incredible talent that he had. So when he found himself in his empty doctor's offices back in the south of England and tried to come up with a really interesting character that was going to grab the public's imagination, he thought of Dr. Bell, and he thought, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could create a character that could use Dr. Bell's observation skills and strategies and combine it with some contemporary interest in crime stories and come up with a kind of a modern day detective story, or really kind of the foundation of the detective story that we know it today. Now, Bell himself, he actually got quite famous during his lifetime because Doyle went around telling everybody that he was the real life Sherlock Holmes, but he was actually also incredibly successful in his lifetime for being really the father of modern forensic science. So many of you have probably watched TV shows like CSI on television, where you see these partnerships between medical doctors, laboratories, and police officers, where they use scientific and medical methods in order to solve crimes. Well, Dr. Joseph Bell was really the first scientist to really use medical techniques and scientific methods in order to solve and research crimes. So this is the same time period where people are developing fingerprinting technology, looking at blood spatter and trajectory. So all that kind of work that he did is still the same kind of work that Doyle was able to incorporate into his Sherlock Holmes stories. One of the other kind of fun tidbits I like to share for those of you who watch a lot of contemporary Sherlock Holmes adaptations, the Elementary TV show that was on CBS for about 7 years paid a lovely homage to Joseph Bell by naming one of their characters after him. So one of their detectives, their New York Police Department detectives, was named Marcus Bell, which is kind of a nice little homage, I think, to the original inspiration. Now, the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, which is one of those novellas, was published in 1887 in this magazine you can see pictured here on the left, A Beaton's Christmas Annual. Doyle was a famously fast writer. He was 27 when he wrote this, and he wrote the entire novel in about 3 weeks. But it took him a couple of years actually to find a home for it before it got published. It came out, it really didn't, kind of was like a drop in a pond. It didn't get a lot of critical attention, didn't grab the public's eye. He followed it up a couple of years later, writing another novella, The Sign of Four, or The Sign of the Four, depending on which kind of Sherlockian you are and where it was published, for Lippincott's magazine in the United States. They asked him to write a new adventure story for their magazine, and as being a smart, good writer, he's like, well, I have these characters in my back pocket here. I'm going to bring them out and try another story. Again, it really didn't get a lot of press or attention. It wasn't until 1891 when Doyle started publishing the Sherlock Holmes short stories in the Strand magazine, pictured here on your right, that Sherlock Holmes really took off as an international phenomenon. There's fantastic stories within just a year or so of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes coming out in the Strand magazine, of libraries actually having to extend their hours anytime a new Strand magazine came out with a Holmes story, because people would line up around the building in order to get a copy. So he was incredibly popular. Even within a year, people were using the name Sherlock as shorthand for someone who had superior intelligence. So he really grabbed the public's imagination. It's a real surprise then for a lot of people to hear that in just a few years, Conan Doyle started talking to his friends and family and editors about killing off Sherlock Holmes and really dedicating the rest of his writing career to writing those serious historical novels. So in about 1893, Doyle, in his letters and his diary, started writing to his family to say he's sick and tired of writing about Sherlock Holmes. He's got some great descriptions during this time period. He described Sherlock Holmes like being an old man of the sea around his neck, pulling him down and keeping him from greater things. He said writing a Sherlock Holmes story was like eating too much pâté de foie gras. It left him with a sick feeling in his stomach. He was so bothered by writing Sherlock Holmes stories and so frustrated by being kind of pigeonholed as a genre writer that he finally decides in 1893 that he really is going to kill Sherlock Holmes off in one of his most famous stories, The Final Problem. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about the resurrection of Sherlock Holmes, because of course we said, he wrote 60 stories over his lifetime. That wasn't the end. But at that time period, people really reacted so strongly. And Doyle, in his autobiography years later, wrote one of my favorite sentences. He said, "I have been much to blame for doing that gentleman to death, but I maintain that if I had not killed him, he would have killed me." He called the killing off Sherlock Holmes justifiable homicide and self-defense. He couldn't take it any longer. But of course, as we know, he came back and returned to writing about the Sherlock Holmes stories. The last Sherlock Holmes story that was ever published was in 1927, The Adventure of Shoscombe Old Place, before, of course, Doyle succumbed to a heart attack in 1930. Now, another fun little fact is that Sherlock Holmes memorabilia is incredibly valuable and very collectible. Just as one example of that Beaton's Christmas Annual, where A Study in Scarlet was first published. Now, you have to remember, the Beaton's Christmas Annual is kind of like a modern-day magazine. So if you think about a People magazine or a Life magazine, something that's pretty thick, but paper and bound together, so very disposable, not made to last for 135 years. Today, there are only believed to be 11 full copies of the Beaton's Christmas Annual in which The Study in Scarlet first came out. Most of them are held in archives around the world. Some are in private collections. The last one that went up for auction, it was about 15 years ago, sold for $156,000. So just in the last few years, a couple of handwritten Conan Doyle manuscripts have sold for over $250,000. So it's incredibly collectible. And we'll talk a little about Sherlock Holmes museums around the world later as well. So with kind of that memorabilia and the collectability of Holmes and his popularity, there are some popular theories out there that try to explain why he's grabbed the public's attention so much over the last century. So some of the theories focus on that the Sherlock Holmes stories reinforce this post-Enlightenment worldview that the world is knowable. So what do I mean by that? Well, in every single Sherlock Holmes story, the story starts off with this incredible mystery that nobody seems able to solve. It seems impossible and unknowable. But Holmes shows us over and over again in the stories that if you just know how to look for evidence, if you do your research and have a bank of knowledge, that you can solve even the most seemingly unsolvable mysteries. And that's a really reassuring worldview in the chaos that we kind of live in the modern world. Other people say they love the Sherlock Holmes stories because they love stories that show the triumph of good over evil. And I usually ask them if they've read a Sherlock Holmes story recently, because actually Sherlock Holmes is not very interested in the triumph of good over evil. Instead, he seemed to be much more interested in kind of solving a puzzle and getting over his own boredom than he is of making sure bad guys go to jail. And I'll just give you one example. In The Adventure of the Boscombe Valley Mystery, and here's your spoiler alert, a man has been brutally murdered, had his head bashed in with a rock. And at the end of the story, Holmes reveals that his neighbor is the culprit, and the man confesses to Holmes and Watson. Watson, kind of good assistant that he is, says to Holmes, "Do you want me to call the police?" And Sherlock Holmes says, "I don't work for the police." So he doesn't care whether McCarthy, the guilty victim, actually goes to jail for doing his misdeed. Instead, Holmes was hired by a young woman to prove that her fiance was actually not guilty of this crime. Holmes believes he's got enough circumstantial evidence to get the guy off, so he doesn't really care if McCarthy goes to jail or not. So he doesn't seem always be particularly interested in the ethics of the stories, but rather more kind of the puzzle that's there. Other people say they love the Sherlock Holmes story because of our nostalgia for the Victorian time period and values, that we love to think that the past was somehow a better place and our lives always would have been better in that. And I usually joke with, any kind of groups that I talk to, and I say the majority of us would probably be dead by now. We would have died by poverty or in childbirth. Maybe one or two of us would have been lucky to be rich enough to be able to live a little bit longer. This kind of nostalgia, though, is why I always love the background picture here of Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes from the Grenada PBS series from the 1980s, my first Sherlock Holmes. And we see all those Victorian trappings here, right? You've got top hats and bowler hats. You've got gas lamps, London fog. You've got cobblestones, streets. So all you need is a horse-drawn cab and you're going to be all set, right? Now, lastly, a lot of people will tell me that they're not even really fans of mysteries, but they really like the Holmes and Watson relationship in the stories and all the different versions. It's a really unique male friendship that you see. It's quite domestic. Many of the stories kind of start off with Holmes and Watson sitting across the breakfast table, eating together, kind of talking about their day or troubles with servants, or, Holmes insulting Watson about how he's not observant about his world. But it's a really unique relationship that you see in fiction over time. But I kept kind of going back over these theories about his popularity over and over again, and I kept asking myself, what was specific to Sherlock Holmes in these theories? If you think about a nostalgia for the Victorian time period, for example, why isn't something like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol the most famous, or Ebenezer Scrooge the most portrayed fictional character of all time? So, because when I think kind of Victorian nostalgia and time period, there's kind of nothing more nostalgic, I think, than A Christmas Carol. What is it about this friendship that makes it so unique compared to other friendships or relationships in the 19th century? So I started to think a little more deeply about what seems unique and specific to Sherlock Holmes as a character that we don't necessarily see in other characters throughout the 19th century. And so this is where kind of a couple of my theories come from, and this is what we're going to talk a little about tonight. So we're going to talk about the time period and the culture, what was going on when Sherlock Holmes was first published and really grabbed the public's attention. We're going to talk about how audiences responded to him as a fictional character, which is really unique and something that has continued over the life of the character from the 19th century all the way to the 21st century in really unique ways. We're going to talk about the identifiable place, what I call the narrative world of Sherlock Holmes, which everybody knows, even if they've never read a story. We're going to talk about those immediately recognizable characteristics like we started, and this theoretical term detachability, which I promise I will define and explain once we get there. So what do I mean by the right cultural moment? Well, when the Sherlock Holmes stories came out, 1887, really grabbed the public's attention in 1891, we were at the end of a century. So there was a real public sense and feeling of change, of momentum, and kind of incoming modernity. England at the time is the most powerful nation in the world, thanks to Queen Victoria's imperialist machine. About 25% of the world's population around 1901 was controlled by Great Britain. So about 1 out of every 4 people was a subject to Queen Victoria. And part of that kind of cultural power and cachet meant that British goods and British culture had a particular interest around the world. It also made England a quite wealthy country, of course. It's the rise of scientific empiricism. So a lot of the scientific theories taught in public schools today actually come out of the 19th century, and the British will happily tell you also from British scientists. So you can go back to the 1830s, where you have a scientist named Lyell, who theorizes that the Earth is actually millions of years old, rather than the few thousand years old that the Bible tells us so. A couple of decades later, building on Lyell's theories, Charles Darwin comes along and publishes The Origin of Species, where he challenges people's conceptions of how long and how old the human species has been around on Earth as well. You've got scientists talking and discovering fossils. You've got paleontologists working on dinosaurs and theorizing. All of these scientists were working in a public realm where they gave public talks just like I'm talking with you right now, as well as writing for public publications for the average audience member. So there was a real general interest in the public during this time period about scientific methods, empiricism, scientific discovery, and theories. It really was in the air. There's also increased literacy during this time period. In particular, in 1884, Britain passed their first ever Federal Education Act, which provided free public education to all children from the ages of 5 to 11. Now, before this act in 1884, if you were wealthy, of course, your parents could hire tutors or governesses to educate you at home or send you to boarding schools and university for education. If you were poor, you might be lucky to live in a village or the city where you could go to a parochial school run by a local church where working class people might learn particular trades or skills. For example, think even like Bob Cratchit could learn something like bookkeeping and mathematics. Young ladies could learn things like millinery so they could go work in a hat shop or work in a clothing store and make clothing. But for most children, that was out of reach. Now, remember that this 1884 Education Act comes along. All children in England from the ages of 5 to 11 now can have basic reading and writing skills. Now, remember, when did the Sherlock Holmes stories get published and take off? 1887, 1891. Right when that first generation of children come through that products of that Education Act, and they're hungry for lots of new reading material. So in response to this new young reading population, there's a huge boon in the 1890s in affordable magazine publishing. Magazines like The Strand, Punch, different magazines came out, and they were looking and paying for people to write stories, particularly adventure stories for young boys, stories for young girls. Girls' Own paper comes out during this time period too, and they would pay by the word for people to write these stories. And this is kind of the environment that Doyle steps in. But one really unique thing about the Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories at this cultural moment in particular, I think, is that Doyle actually invents a new genre of writing that no one had ever written before. He really invents the modern day series as we know it. So before the Sherlock Holmes short stories, many writers in the 19th century had published in what we call a serial format. So that's Serial. So people like Charles Dickens would embark on a long novel or project, and they would publish in a magazine series of updates. So this month in Dickens magazine Cornhill, you might get the first 3 chapters of Great Expectations. You come back next month, you get chapters 4 through 6. Come back again, you continue on until you finish the novel, after which Dickens would then sell the entire manuscript to a bookseller who would bind it, and then wealthy people could buy a private copy, or libraries would buy a copy, and of course you could check them out from your local lending library. Now in the 1890s, when Doyle was pitching his idea to the Strand magazine editor, so he actually wrote to them and he said, this model of the serial novel is really problematic for magazines, because if for any reason your audience can't purchase the latest update, whether because they're traveling, they're sick, they don't have money, he said, you lose them for the rest of the run. There's no reruns, right? You won't be able to catch up. You won't know what's happened. So instead, what he proposes is a new form of storytelling where you have a couple of familiar characters who come back again and again in a series of stories which are episodic in nature. Each one has a unique and distinct beginning, middle, and end, and can be read independently. So if for some reason your reader misses the March update of the Strand magazine with the Sherlock Holmes story, they can come back in April and buy the next copy because they can read the stories in any order. But they'll keep coming back because they know the characters. Now, this is really revolutionary for us because he really invents that modern series, and that series dominates how we consume media today. We watch television series, we read book series, we watch movie series, we listen to podcast series and things on the radio, and it really dominates the way that we consume media today, and we didn't really have that before the Sherlock Holmes story. So I think that's a really unique contribution of Doyle's. Now, one other way to kind of gauge Holmes's popularity is to look at how audiences have responded to him as a fictional character over time, and they really reacted in unique ways. So if you look what I have here on the screen, what does this look like? It looks like a fake obituary, right? Or it looks like a real obituary. So I mentioned earlier in 1893, remember, Doyle had gotten sick of writing the Sherlock Holmes stories and decides to kill him off in his story, The Final Problem. That's where Sherlock Holmes meets his arch nemesis, Professor Moriarty, the only time Moriarty actually shows up in any of those 60 stories. When that story was published, the public lost their mind. There are amazing stories of people crying in the streets. They were sobbing over the death of Sherlock Holmes. There's legends that young men wore black armbands and put crepe on their hats to be in mourning. Doyle says that in his autobiography, he was attacked on the street. A little old lady bashed him over the head with her umbrella and called him a brute. He received hundreds of letters of hate mail and demanding he bring Sherlock Holmes back to life. And one of my favorite pieces of information was the Strand magazine alone reported that more than 2,000, I would say this, 20,000, not 20,000 subscribers canceled their subscription to the magazine in protest and demanded that Conan Doyle bring Sherlock Holmes back. Now, we don't see this kind of reaction to the death of a fictional character anywhere in history, not even when Professor Dumbledore died in the Harry Potter series. Now, when that story came out, besides kind of those public reactions we had here, we started to see these little entries pop up in British newspapers and even in America, just like we have here. So this actually was published in a Welsh newspaper in December of 1893 called the Western Mail. And you can see this looks like an obituary for a real person. And if you read it, it says, a correspondent writes, Sherlock Holmes is no more. He dies with his name ringing in men's ears. The police of the world are left with their inferior resources to deal with crime as of old. And the new number of the Strand magazine, the career of this, the most wonderful detective, amateur or otherwise, known to fiction, is brought to an end. How? It would be unfair to say. Enough that he meets with one who is, quote, on the same intellectual plane as himself, and the result is decisive, though there is no place for boasting. This creation of Sherlock Holmes is really great. There seemed no possibility of giving freshness to a favorite character of French fiction, but Dr. Conan Doyle has done that and more. He has touched the imagination anew, and with amazing fertility and daring, has made one person famous over the world. Sherlock Holmes will not be forgotten by this generation, at least. Now, if you look at this kind of pseudo-obituary, you also start to see something magical kind of start to happen. Right there at the beginning, it says, the police of the world are left with their inferior resources to deal with crime as of old. Sherlock Holmes is the most wonderful detective who's ever lived. They're talking about him as if he was a real person. There's this fantastical, magical moment where Holmes himself starts to shift from a fictional character into being a real historical figure. And you see this the way that people talk about Sherlock Holmes over and over the next century. Now, once Doyle killed Sherlock Holmes off and started dedicating himself to writing serious fiction, there were a whole lot of other writers who thought, well, I can jump on that bandwagon and make a few dollars if Doyle doesn't want to. So immediately after he killed him off, the press, the newspapers and the magazines in particular, were literally flooded with hundreds of Sherlock Holmes parodies, all different kinds of ones. You've got a couple here, Picklock Holes, which came out right in 1893 when Doyle kills him off. You've got Sherlock Holmes, and his partner was Dr. Watson in the early 19th teens and 20s. There's comics. Comics are starting to come alive during the 1890s and the early 20th century as well, and Sherlock Holmes shows up in quite a few of those. You'll see that a lot of them are parodies of Sherlock Holmes. There's also an American one about 1915 with a little girl called Curly Holmes. Lots of different kind of Sherlock Holmes parodies and different versions all through the press, with other people telling these stories in Doyle's place. Now, throughout this whole time, Doyle is really being pestered kind of by the public and by publishers constantly in editorials and letters to the editor columns, with writers and fans really begging him to bring Sherlock Holmes back to life. And he refused over and over and over again until about 1901. He gets an offer from a publisher, and Doyle decides, all right, he'll cave to the fan pressure. He'll write one more Sherlock Holmes story, and he agrees to write a novel where he says, but I'm not bringing Holmes back to life. This is a one-off deal. I'm setting this in the timeline before Sherlock ever meets Moriarty, and he comes out with the publication of The Hound of the Baskervilles, probably the most famous Sherlock Holmes novel that Conan Doyle wrote. So once he decided to publish that story, the public and the publishers really wouldn't leave him alone. There were more and more demands for more Sherlock Holmes stories, and within a year or so, Doyle was receiving incredible offers and sums from publishers. Collier's magazine in the United States kept offering him money to bring Sherlock Holmes back to life. 1903, they make him an offer of about 15,000 American dollars to write 6 Sherlock Holmes stories. Doyle says, nope, I'm not interested. They said, well, okay, how about $35,000 for 12 Sherlock Holmes stories? He said, nope, still not interested. They said, okay, $45,000 for 12 Sherlock Holmes stories. And the Strand magazine in London said, and we'll kick in an extra £100 for every 1,000 words you write. And Doyle said, done. So in 1903, he brings Sherlock Holmes back to life in The Adventure of the Empty House. Sherlock Holmes reveals he faked his death when he faced off Moriarty in the Reichenbach Falls. He's been away fighting and destroying Moriarty's army across Europe, and he comes back and, as we know, continues on until the last story, The Adventure of Shas Commode, place in 1927. Now, when Arthur Conan Doyle dies in 1930, and he has this global following for his Sherlock Holmes stories, his fans finally had to accept that there wasn't going to be any more new original Sherlock Holmes stories. And what they decide to do in the next decade, in the 1930s, is to create kind of book clubs, basically modern day book clubs, which they called Keep Sherlock Holmes Alive societies, where educated, you could see white gentlemen would get together and share kind of facts and points about their favorite Sherlock Holmes stories. They would quiz one another. They created crossword puzzles and games and really focused on specialized knowledge. And these Sherlock Holmes societies started popping up all over the world. The image that you have here is really from the most famous and the most prestigious Sherlock Holmes Society, which is the Baker Street Irregulars, who are out of New York City. They're still going strong. They were a men-only organization all the way up to the 1990s, and it's by invitation only. And no, I am not a member. They have not invited me yet. They make me a little nervous. You have to pass a rigorous exam in order to be able to become a member. And they have different kind of events. One of the biggest ones you can see pictured here is every January 6th, they have a giant birthday dinner for Sherlock Holmes to celebrate his birthday. Now remember, he's a fictional character, so we actually don't know when his birthday is. It's not in any of those stories. But they still have a party every single year in New York. Right around the same time, the 1930s, 1934, 1937, there's another Sherlock Holmes Society, pretty much starts around the same time period, the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. They're a little more democratic. You pay them £50 and you can become a member. A large group, large society. They also have a January birthday party for Holmes in early January. Wonderful toasts to fictional characters and different kind of contributions to Sherlock Holmes' popularity over the years as well. Now, while the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and the Baker Street Irregulars of New York City may seem like obvious Sherlock Holmes societies, largely populous cities, lots of people there are a lot of these. There's more than 700 active Sherlock Holmes societies in the world today, and they're in some places you may not expect in the United States. One of the most prolific societies in the United States is actually in Peoria, Illinois. The Sherlock Holmes Society in Peoria is quite popular and successful and have been for decades. As I mentioned, many of these societies were men only. So in the 60s, any women who were fans of Sherlock Holmes Society decided to create their own society. So they created the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes in the 60s. And then, of course, they went a little co-ed later on once the Baker Street Irregulars allowed women into their midst in the 1990s as well. Now, what surprises a lot of people is where some of the largest societies and most popular society is in the entire world. And that's actually in Japan. The Japanese Sherlock Holmes Society is one of the largest in the world with more than 1,000 active members. There's been a lot of interest in Japanese culture in the Sherlock Holmes stories right from the beginning. We do have records and evidence that the original stories were translated into Japanese right in the 1890s, almost as soon as the original adventure stories came out. So there's a long connection in history between the two countries and the stories there with Japan. One of the other features I mentioned that seems unique to the Sherlock Holmes character is that he's identified with a very specific place. And so if we were all in a big room together, I would ask you all to shout out, where does Sherlock Holmes live, right? Because everybody knows 221B Baker Street in London. Even people who've never read a Sherlock Holmes story knows where Sherlock Holmes lives. And I would ask you, if we were in person, to say, can you tell me the address of any other fictional character in history? Just think about that for a second. We could pull out examples and say, well, what about Romeo and Juliet? And we say, well, they were from Verona, Italy, but we really don't know their address. What about Jake Gatsby from The Great Gatsby? We could say, okay, West Egg, that's Long Island, New York. What about Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind? You say, okay, I know Tara, I know the name of her plantation, which is outside of Atlanta. But it's very challenging. Only my Harry Potter fans can actually tell me the fictional address of a character. But this comes up in Sherlock Holmes lore and fandom from the last century and more, over and over again. How does everyone know around the world that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street? Well, it comes up in things like this. It's part of the language and the stories that go around the character. So this is a wonderful sonnet written by a man named Vincent Starrett, who was an actor and a poet and one of those original Baker Street Irregulars in the 30s and the 40s. He wrote the sonnet called 221B. And it reads, here dwell together still two men of note who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote, that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears attuned to catch the distant view halloo. England is England yet for all our fears. Only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain. The ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive, and it is always 1895. Now, if we look at the date of this poem, 1942, of course, what's going on in the world? We've got World War II happening. You see a lot of those pieces we talked about early on about the popularity of Sherlock Holmes. You've got a chaotic world that's being bombed, right? Even though all the world is going to explode, Holmes and Watson are still going to be immortal, and they're going to reassure us that we're going to live in a calm world. Elements of, the nostalgia for the Victorian time period. You've got the London fog, you've got gas lamps, you've got cobblestone streets. All those pieces are in this and all tied up together with that address 221B. Now, the fun thing, of course, is that you can actually go to London and go to 221B Baker Street and see where Sherlock Holmes lived. I've been there several times. This was one time. It was on the hottest day of my life. Had my picture taken with Dr. John Watson, who's looking pretty good for probably being about 175 years old in this picture. And you can look around in the picture and you can see you can put on his deerstalker, or you could put on a bowler hat. You've got the Sherlock Holmes pipe here. You can see his meerschaum, his Persian slipper where he keeps his tobacco. Behind me, we've got all of Holmes's chemistry equipment. Right here by my feet, you can see some of his music for his violin playing. Remember, he's a fictional character, but you can see all of those things. When you go to 221B Baker Street, you'll see, of course, the door here on the left, which says 221B Baker Street. There's usually a lovely man standing in front in a Victorian policeman's outfit. To the right, you see the Sherlock Holmes Museum, which is a fantastic gift shop. Even if you don't tour the museum, the gift shop is definitely worth it. You go all the way to the back, you can purchase your museum ticket, come back, give it to the bobby in front of the door, and you can tour all 3 stories of his apartments and see all of the trappings of his life. Now, above that door, you'll actually see a blue plaque. Now, we live in New England and we see plaques like this all the time, right? What are those plaques for? Well, they're historical markers, right? So we'll see, Paul Revere lived here, Nathaniel Hawthorne died here actually in Plymouth, and we've got a historical marker. So you can see at 221B, Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, lived here 1881 to 1904. Except remember, he's a fictional character. I love this plaque is actually even a fake plaque. It does not have the seal of the Historical Society of London. But the Sherlock Holmes people love plaques. So you've got this fake plaque above the door at 221B Baker Street. If you go to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the oldest hospital in London, there's a brass plaque in the wall that says, on this spot on January 1st in 1881, Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson met for the very first time. If you go to Switzerland and you go to the top of the Reichenbach waterfalls, there's the site where Sherlock Holmes allegedly fell to his death in the grasp of Professor Moriarty, you'll find a plaque that says, on this spot, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, grappled with his enemy, Professor Moriarty, and allegedly plunged off to his death. If you go to the Criterion Bar, a couple of years ago, there was a big press release right around 2012 or 2013 that the Criterion Bar right in Piccadilly Circus in London, it's been around for over 100 years, was having a big reveal of a new plaque that said inside the restaurant and bar, on this spot, January 1st in 1881, Dr. John Watson had lunch with his friend Mike Stanford from the Army, who then took him to St. Bartholomew's Hospital and introduced him to Sherlock Holmes. So over and over, we see kind of all of this blurring between Sherlock Holmes as a fictional character and Sherlock Holmes as a historical figure. Now, of course, another fun fact about 221B, this great site of the Sherlock Holmes home and apartment, is that in 1887, when Conan Doyle first wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, the houses actually on Baker Street in that time period only numbered up to 100. So when Doyle created the fictional character, remember, he's a native Scotsman living in the south of England. He's not a native Londoner. He pulled out a map of London and he thought, well, where would be a cool bohemian neighborhood for my detective to live in? And kind of plunked his finger right down on Baker Street. And he invented 221 Baker Street on the spot. Well, it wasn't until the 1930s that the Westminster City Council, which is the area of London where 221 Baker Street is, decided to extend the street, and 221 Baker Street became a reality. And the first tenants of 221 Baker Street was a boring bank, the Abbey National Bank, who opened their doors in 1930. As soon as they opened up, they started receiving mail addressed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The Abbey National Bank received so much mail addressed to Sherlock Holmes that they hired a full-time secretary to respond to every piece of mail that came in. That secretary's job title literally was the secretary to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. She responded to every piece of mail that came in, acknowledged and thanked people for sending in, and said, unfortunately, Mr. Holmes was away and unable to respond to their pleas. There's a fantastic collection of these letters, the best letters from the Abbey National Bank, in a wonderful book by a scholar named Richard Lancelyn Green. And some of them are just fantastic to read. So you've got people who clearly know he's a fictional character and they're kind of playing along, and they'll write, Dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I love that adventure of the blue carbuncle, keep up the good work. You had people who wrote to Sherlock Holmes during the Blitz in the 1940s asking, Dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, can you please help Britain fight off the Nazis? You had children writing to him, trying to hire him. Dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, we've lost our cat Fluffy, can you please help? But some of my favorites actually were the ones from women all throughout the 20th century, offering if Mrs. Hudson was ever going to retire, they'd be happy to step in and work as Holmes and Watson's new housekeeper. Now, all the way up to 1990, the Abbey National Bank was still receiving about 200 to 300 letters a week addressed to Sherlock Holmes. So why 1990, Anne? Why did you pick that date? Well, in 1990, a family decided to get into the tourism business and open their very own Sherlock Holmes Museum up the road on Baker Street. They couldn't believe that nobody else had come up with this idea or been able to make this work. So they opened the Sherlock Holmes Museum up at 239 Baker Street, and it takes off pretty quickly as a success for tourists. Now, the Westminster City Council thinks, wow, this is a fantastic idea. This is going to do so much good business for London and for the city here that it's really just a shame that this fantastic museum for tourists is down at 239 and this actual boring bank is actually at 221 Baker Street. So they renumbered the street. So if you actually go to London today and go to Baker Street and look at the addresses, the numbers on each of the doors, you'll see 235, 237, 221B, 241, 243. So they numbered the street, renumbered the street so it would match up with the fictional story of Sherlock Holmes to support the museum. And there's, hundreds and hundreds of visitors who come every single day. Now, one of the other things that seems really unique with Sherlock Holmes is that he's instantly recognizable. Now, there are a lot of sexy Sherlock Holmes costumes out there on the internet, let me just tell you, with all the different kinds of trappings. But this is a unique thing about this character, that if you pick apart kind of any one of these pieces, he becomes instantly recognizable to people around the world. So let's kind of talk about some of these pieces. So if you ask anybody, like, what's a Sherlock Holmes pipe? They're going to totally point to the images you see over here on the left side of the screen, right? The long curved pipe. It's a meerschaum pipe, often called a Sherlock Holmes pipe. You'll see it in pictures with Sherlock Holmes. You'll see it in clip art with Sherlock Holmes over and over again. If you just show anybody that pipe, they would instantly think Sherlock Holmes. In all actuality, Arthur Conan Doyle never describes Sherlock Holmes smoking a meerschaum pipe in any of the 60 original stories. Instead, he does describe Sherlock Holmes smoking a briar pipe, which you'll see here on the right, and in this illustration from the American artist Frederick Dorr Steele. So how is it that everyone thinks the meerschaum pipe with the big calabash on the bottom is the Sherlock Holmes pipe? Well, we can blame this guy. This is William Gillette. He's an American playwright and actor from the late 19th century. Some of you actually may know him because his house, Gillette Castle in Connecticut, is now actually a national park. He was an incredibly successful author and playwright. And in the 1890s, when Doyle decided he did not want to write the Sherlock Holmes stories anymore, Gillette wrote him a letter and asked his permission if he could write a play featuring Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And Doyle famously said, "Do whatever you want with him, I don't care." So Gillette writes this Sherlock Holmes play, produces it, puts it on in London, and it is incredibly successful. So successful, it runs sold out for years. He takes the production company over to London, sells out in London for a few years, comes back to the United States, and pretty much makes a living as being kind of the modern day embodiment of Sherlock Holmes from 1899 all the way to his death. He was also one of the first actors to portray Sherlock Holmes on screen. His play was turned into a silent film in 1915. It was, thought till just recently to completely lost to posterity, but they found and were able to restore a copy literally in the last 5 years or so, so you can watch it. He's incredibly successful. So when Gillette was putting on his play and working on the stage directions, he wanted to be instantly recognizable to the audience every time he stepped on the stage as Sherlock Holmes. He had beautiful, elaborate dressing gowns, and he wanted to be able to have that distinct pipe. And so while he was practicing for the play, he was trying to be faithful to the stories, and he was using that briar pipe, and he found that he couldn't articulate his lines and have the pipe clenched in his mouth at the same time. He would end up kind of jumbling and mumbling his words. So he kind of went back to the prop closet, grabbed the meerschaum pipe, and because of the curved pipe stem, he could clench it in his teeth, and he could still enunciate and articulate all his words. So it was a very kind of practical solution for how the meerschaum pipe kind of becomes part of the Sherlock Holmes iconography over time. Now, I'll also kind of my own theory will add on to Gillette's kind of talk about being able to deliver his lines with the pipe. If you imagine staging a play and you've got a large playhouse and it may even have balconies, which one of these props is going to be more visible from the back of the house or a balcony? The meerschaum pipe, right? It's instantly recognizable. Now, Gillette, because of his touring, because of his silent film, he gets drawn as Sherlock Holmes as the cover of Time magazine, becomes kind of one of the first modern people associated with that Sherlock Holmes identity. And his image and his representation gets picked up by the modern imagination. Now, the second piece that even we saw in that sexy Halloween costume, right, is that Sherlock Holmes over and over again in Halloween costumes and in different kind of incarnations is constantly being shown wearing a very particular kind of coat. It's this Inverness Cloak, which is tweed, it's often plaid, and it has this kind of unique short cape over the top of it. In all reality, again, Arthur Conan Doyle in all of those 60 stories never once describes Sherlock Holmes wearing an Inverness cloak anywhere near like what we see over and over again in our modern representations. So where does this come from? Well, you can blame this guy. Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce in the late 1930s and early 1940s make about 14 films portraying Sherlock Holmes and John Watson together. Half of those were set in the original Victorian time period. Half of them are actually set in modern day. Really interesting. Holmes and Watson in the 1940s fighting the Nazis. But in those Victorian versions, you see Basil Rathbone over and over again, as in this image, kind of clad from head to toe in plaid tweed, where he's got that Inverness cloak on. So for this new generation of kind of golden Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s, Basil Rathbone takes over the public imagination for what Sherlock Holmes looked like, how he dresses, and how he's recognizable. Now, if you take that same movie and kind of jump ahead even 10 or 20 more years with the invention of television and the popularity of televisions coming into households across the United States and around the world, what were the first things that were on local television channels on the weekends? old movies, right? Because we didn't have a lot of television program at that time. So in the 60s and 70s, what you would find on Saturday afternoons or Sunday mornings is reruns of old black and white films from the 30s and the 40s, just like the Basil Rathbone films. So for an entire new generation, to even 20 years later, Basil Rathbone, his look, his attribute, grabs the public imagination of this is what Sherlock Holmes looked like. Now, the last, but probably the most recognizable piece, right, of Sherlock Holmes's iconography, its instantly recognizable characteristics, is that deerstalker hat. People call it a Sherlock Holmes hat. It's a deerstalker hat. I'm sure you're saying, Anne, no. Of course, Arthur Conan Doyle must have described Sherlock Holmes wearing that deerstalker hat at least once in those 60 stories. How else would we know that this is the most famous kind of piece of his costume and his identity? But the reality is he didn't. This is another example. It never shows up in any of the 60 stories. But what's fascinating is that this is perhaps the earliest example we have of how the media has influenced our impression and memory of the Sherlock Holmes character. So this is a clip of a larger illustration from an original Sherlock Holmes story. It's actually The Adventure of the Silver Blaze, where you have a drawing of Sherlock Holmes here. I've got cut across a picture of Dr. Watson's in a train carriage with him, and they're heading out to Ascot in Windsor to investigate the disappearance of a racehorse. They're heading out into the country, into a rural area, and you'll see Sherlock Holmes has been drawn wearing a deerstalker in this particular image. This was complete artistic license. The illustrator, Sidney Paget, is well known, very famous now for drawing most of the original Sherlock Holmes illustrations, all for the Strand magazine. Sherlock Holmes in this story is just described as wearing a cloth cap. Sidney Paget was the one who puts him in this deerstalker. So, excuse me. So the next question, of course, you're going to ask me is, all right, Anne, how many times did Sidney Paget draw Sherlock Holmes in that deerstalker hat? How did it become so recognizable and so well known? 3 times. That's it. Now, there's about 8 to 10 original illustrations in every Sherlock Holmes story. There's 60 Sherlock Holmes stories. So there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these pictures. Paget only drew him wearing a deerstalker 3 times. 2 were actually in this very same story, The Adventure of the Silver Blaze. And yet it gets picked up by the public's imagination and becomes probably the most recognizable characteristic of the character. This is where, if you want to think about kind of a modern day equivalent, the only equivalent I've found that matches kind of Holmes's iconography is Harry Potter. If you think about, if you saw a kid's face with a lightning bolt scar, people would instantly say Harry Potter. If you just saw a pair of round eyeglasses, Harry Potter. Those same attributes you see with his iconography, we see over and over again going back in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, all of these pieces I'm talking to you about are examples of that theoretical term detachability, which I talked about in the beginning. Now, this term comes from an Italian film scholar who was looking at cult movies, and like Casablanca, like, I would say Star Wars, other kind of also oftentimes small kind of cult films that have a really dedicated following who are incredibly knowledgeable about every detail about the film. Now, this Italian scholar, Umberto Eco, was writing about Casablanca, for example, and he said, in cult films, audiences are able to kind of pluck out original scenes or catchphrases, let's say, and put them and use them in completely original and new situations. So if you think about just Casablanca, for example, and I'm no expert on Casablanca, there are a lot of famous quotes from that movie that people use over and over and over again. I start with my favorite one, which of course was "Play It Again, Sam," because it's not actually what they say in the film, which is "Play it, Sam." There's, of all the gin joints and all over Europe, you had to walk into this one. This is the start of a beautiful friendship. The reference to The Usual Suspects, over and over and over again. There are all these catchphrases from Casablanca that get picked up and used in all these different places in contemporary culture, all the way through to today. For my family, I would like to joke it was always Star Wars quotes that we would quote with one another. So you don't need me to tell you, right, that Dr. Watson never says this censored phrase in any of those 60 short stories. But I'll usually bet anybody walking into my talk a nickel that they think that that Sherlock Holmes absolutely says elementary, my dear Watson, in those original 60 stories. And once again, it's not true. He never says elementary, my dear Watson, in any of those 56 original short stories or 4 novellas. Not even once, not even close. So how is it that everyone around the world knows this is what Sherlock Holmes says all the time? Elementary, my dear Watson. Well, on the one hand, I would say, I actually don't care. I don't care where it comes from. I'm more interested in how you all know that this is what Sherlock Holmes says. How did we absorb this from our media culture? But then I joke, and I think you'll get frustrated with me if I at least don't try to explain. The real truth is actually we don't know. We've had Sherlock Holmes scholars who've worked on this question to try to find the source of that phrase for decades. Some people have theorized that it came from a radio play, an American radio play written by a woman, Edith Meiser, that came out in the 1930s. But we have no evidence in any of the scripts or any of the recordings. Some other people say it connects back to a P.G. Wodehouse novel in 1915 that kind of had a Sherlock Holmes parody character in there. Yes, that character uses the word elementary, but nothing like elementary, my dear Watson. The biggest one that people think of that they can come close to is that William Gillette play. But I've read the script, I've seen the silent film, and elementary, my dear Watson never comes up in any of that. So we really don't know where the origin of that is. There's a recent Swedish scholar named Matthias Bostrom who has a real big, wonderful book called From Holmes to Sherlock. He's hypothesized that it has to have evolved from that William Gillette play in 1899 because he's looked back and done research in newspapers, actually, in the United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States. And he can find that by about 1905, people are using the catchphrase, elementary, my dear Watson, as a joke. It's a parody, it's a punchline by 1905 on both sides of the Atlantic. And if he backs up pre kind of 1899, he can't find it anywhere. And the only shared experience he can find is that play. But we don't have any written evidence that that's actually where the source is. So elementary, my dear Watson kind of remains part of a mystery still of the Sherlock Holmes story. Now, a lot of people have kind of detached Sherlock Holmes out of his original fictional world and put him in a lot of different places. So we're going to talk a little bit about adaptations here and how Sherlock Holmes stories and his character have kind of continued to grow and proliferate. I've just got a couple of interesting examples here. There are literally hundreds of Sherlock Holmes pastiches published every single year. So it's practically impossible to try to keep an up-to-date list of all of them. I picked a few favorites and just some samples here. And the yellow one in the top right, A Study in Sherlock, is just an example of lots of different collections of short stories by contemporary writers where you have people writing in the style of Sherlock Holmes and kind of trying their hand at a Sherlock Holmes story. In this collection here, Study in Sherlock, you'll see Lee Child actually has a story in this one. So does Jacqueline Winspear and a couple other famous writers who you might be familiar with. Stephen King has a famous Sherlock Holmes story. Neil Gaiman is actually in this Study in Sherlock as well. It's a very famous Sherlock Holmes story. There's a lot of collections like this that you can just pick up anytime. The book in the middle, Sherlock Holmes, House of Silk, Anthony Horowitz was chosen by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate to kind of write an authorized Sherlock Holmes pastiche, very much in the style and flavor of Arthur Conan Doyle, about 10 years ago or so. You can see that red seal from the estate there. His second novel, actually, on Moriarty, is even better than this one. It really reads like you're reading an 1890s Victorian novel written by Conan Doyle. Now, other people start to take more creative license with him. The bottom left corner is Nicholas Meyer's 1970s pastiche called the 7% Solution, which is like just a real product I also love of the 1970s. It also was turned into a film. Sherlock Holmes has become addicted, goes back and forth between cocaine and morphine. He's become paranoid. Watson is very worried about him. So he decides to take him to Austria so Holmes can be psychoanalyzed by Sigmund Freud. I just love the kind of imagination of that story. Bottom right, Michael Chabon, who's an American National Book Award winner, wrote a lovely, real small book about kind of Holmes in retirement during World War II called The Final Solution. And it's involved in kind of German code breaking and getting involved in like local village politics. A couple of other really fun ones. The Sherlockian by Graham Moore came out. It's about those contemporary Sherlock Holmes societies. So this young man is getting really excited. He's getting ready to basically get inducted into the equivalent of the Baker Street Irregulars. One of the members shows up at the annual convention claiming to have found an unpublished Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes story. And then, dun, 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 of course, he's found murdered in his hotel room. The door's been locked from the inside and the manuscript is missing. So it's a fantastic mystery about those Sherlock Holmes societies. And then one of my absolute favorites I highly recommend is Laurie R. King's series, the Mary Russell series, the first of which is here, The Beekeeper's Apprentice. And again, it's kind of the premise is Sherlock Holmes in retirement in Sussex, and he decides to take up his 15-year-old female neighbor and train her to be the next world's only consulting detective. It's a really successful series. There's about 15 books in it so far. The first 8 in particular, I highly recommend because they're just really well researched, and she's really clever and playing around with that. Is Sherlock Holmes real? Is he fiction? Well, she's portraying him like a real character in the book. There's been a lot of really exciting kind of innovations recently. So in the last few years, there's been a real boom in kind of gender-swapped Sherlock Holmes stories, where we reimagine Sherlock Holmes as if Sherlock was a woman. So Sherry Thomas, another, she's normally known as an American historical romance writer, came out with this wonderful book, A Study in Scarlet Women, a couple of years ago about this woman, young woman, Charlotte Holmes, who decides that she doesn't really want to have to live her life like a Victorian woman and get married and settle down. So I'll just say she gets herself compromised, so she's no longer eligible for marriage. And she invents a fake sick brother, Sherlock, and she works with him and through him to help solve crimes. There's about 3 books, I think, or 4 books in that series. They're wonderful. There's a young adult series, Brittany Cavallaro's A Study in Charlotte, also a Sherlock Holmes, modern day descendants of the real Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, now in an American boarding school, and they kind of get together and start solving some crimes and righting some wrongs with some ancient family feuds. Probably one of the most original I've seen in the last couple of years is Claire Odell's A Study in Honor. So not only are Holmes and Watson women in this particular story, they're also African Americans. It's a futuristic dystopian novel, kind of post-Trump era that there's been a civil war. Parts of kind of the central Midwest have seceded from the United States, and Watson's got a bionic artificial arm. There are queer characters. It really is kind of this dystopian, futuristic reimagining of what these characters could be like if they were different. So there's lots of really interesting stories coming out. Similarly, we've really had a boom in kind of media stories, right? Different versions on television and film of Sherlock Holmes, particularly in the last 10 years. I kind of picked out some of the most famous and popular. In the top right, of course, I've got Data from Star Trek Next Generation. He used to love playing Sherlock Holmes on the holodeck in Star Trek Next Generation in the 1990s. And the rest are really from the last few years. You know, you've got Elementary, which was on CBS, very successful for about 7 years for a television show. My favorite, which of course was the BBC Sherlock. It's hard to believe that premiered 11 years ago now. We've had 4 seasons of that. Robert Downey Jr. has had a couple of films. He's actually making a third. It's supposed to be coming out this Christmas for his Sherlock Holmes series. And then just Ian McClellan also did one just a couple of years ago based on a novel, A Slight Trick of the Mind, of, again, Sherlock Holmes in retirement, this time kind of suffering from Alzheimer's. There have been Recently, I'm sure you know, on Netflix just this last year, the adaptations of book series, actually, young adult book series on Sherlock Holmes's fictional younger sister who doesn't exist, Enola Holmes, which has been hugely successful on Netflix. So lots of different versions. What most people don't know is that the TV show House is also absolutely, which was hugely successful about 10 or 15 years ago, could be even longer now, a hugely successful Sherlock Holmes adaptation. Really, really clever. It's really an appropriation. You have to think about a lot of the parallels there. Just think about House's name, of course. House sounding like Holmes. Of course, Holmes almost sounds like a homonym to home, as in, the place where you live. So we've got House and Holmes. For the main characters in the TV show, you have House and Wilson, our parallels for our Holmes and Watson. House, of course, deduces people's medical illnesses, like Sherlock Holmes deduces people's crimes. House is a recovering, sometimes suffering and recovering drug addict. Holmes, periodically uses drugs in the original stories in the 1890s and early 20th century. If you have a real eagle eye, House's apartment number, not kidding, in the show, really is 221B. And the show actually ends the story with House faking his death and kind of riding off into the sunset with Wilson, just like Sherlock Holmes faked his death in The Final Problem. So lots of really interesting parallels. And then, of course, there's more that I don't even have time to talk about. Well, we're kind of getting close to wrap up here. One of the last places I really looked at to see what was so special about Sherlock Holmes's popularity was how frequently he shows up in advertising, almost literally from the moment he's created. So I said earlier, Sherlock Holmes really took off with the public in 1891. The first newspaper advertisement using Sherlock Holmes as a character to sell something came out in 1892. It was actually for an ad for Beecham's pills, which are kind of like modern day aspirin. So when you look back over the last century and more, you find Sherlock Holmes coming up in advertising over and over again. And I first thought, well, maybe this will tell me something about like how audiences perceive him, or is it a symbol of something? And so at first, he comes up a lot with tobacco advertising. So I thought, okay, you've got Basil Rathbone selling Chesterfield cigarettes, and we've got Player cigarettes cards that came up with the different stories. So I thought, well, maybe people associate him with smoking, or Sherlock Holmes pipe tobacco up there at the top. And then you'd see some stuff that have to do with security, like the Sherlock security systems, because not only does it sound like Sherlock, of course, like locking a door, but we've got his name. So I thought, okay, that's like connected to his crime fighting. But the more I started looking around and seeing how many examples they were, the weirder they got and the more random. So for example, in the bottom corner of this, you can see, an image of a Sherlock Holmes cartoon character in Sherlock Loans, so you can borrow money. That top right picture I absolutely love, Sherlock's Delight Florida Citrus, so they're selling oranges, of course, playing on the Holmes Fruit Company of Tampa, Florida. But I just love that because it's so incongruous, right? You think Sherlock Holmes crime fighting, you don't think anything about Florida oranges. One of the weirdest, this is one up in the left from 1934. This is actually a photo of Clive Brook, who was a silent film actor, one of the first ones to make several Sherlock Holmes adaptation films. And this is actually an ad for Otis Elevator Company, where they're selling what they call a detective service, which is basically a warning service if the elevator's broken. So think about today, if the elevator gets stuck and the alarm goes off, that's what they're selling here, but they're using Clive Brook's fame as a film star, Sherlock Holmes, in order to sell an elevator alarm service. The most elegant, though, my absolute favorite is this one back down in the bottom right, which is a Gordon's Gin ad from the 1970s. You can see in this beautiful kind of graphic, they've got all the trappings of Sherlock Holmes iconography. He's got the deerstalker hat. He's got the meerschaum pipe. He doesn't have an Inverness cloak on, but he has a little tweed collar. He does have the magnifying glass. That's the one thing about Sherlock Holmes iconography is real. The Study in Scarlet is in the Guinness Book of World Records also for the first story where a detective ever uses a magnifying glass to solve a crime. But it's really in, not only in the iconography here, but in the text, I think we really see some interesting pieces of our Sherlock Holmes puzzle. It reads, "Search no more. Gordon's is undeniably the driest, most delicately flavored gin you can find. The clue, elementary, my dear connoisseur. It is still based on Alexander Gordon's brilliant discovery in 1769. So when we start looking at kind of all these different television and film versions, these textual adaptations, the reproductions and advertising, what you start to see are these copies and kind of morphisms of the Sherlock Holmes character that was originally created by Conan Doyle in the 1880s. What you start to see with every single incarnation is kind of a snowballing effect where the next version picks up on what the latest adaptation had and adds to that, and it continues to evolve, so much so that what we start to have is really a copy of a copy of a copy. The Sherlock Holmes character that we all know and love today and is a global phenomenon is not actually the character that was originally created in those 60 stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, but he's really a modern media invention that get reproduced over and over again so that we have so many copies, but we can't really go back and find any kind of original. So as we kind of wrap up, I hope that, you take away from tonight a little bit of the history behind Arthur Conan Doyle and how the Sherlock Holmes character was created, the culture in which he kind of gained his popularity, public reactions to it, and the different versions that have lived on over the century. But I also really have kind of a secret agenda tonight, more than about being about Sherlock Holmes. I want you to really think deeply about the concept of popularity itself. What makes something popular in our culture? So what is it that makes something last over time? There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of books, songs, television shows, movies that come out every single year around the world, but only certain ones of those last and are reproduced and carry on for generation after generation. So what is it about these key pieces that make them last? And I really want you to think about your own behaviors and the choices that you make every day in your life about your media consumption and your favorites. Every time you have a conversation with your spouse to say, "Oh my gosh, have you seen that new TV show?" Or your best friend, "Oh my gosh, have you read this book yet?" Or "Did you see or hear that song on the radio?" Every time we participate in those conversations, each and every one of us is playing a really important role in determining the past and the present and future of modern media consumption. So that's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'll stop the screen share here so we can kind of answer any questions you might have this evening.
Wow, that was great. We already have questions coming into the chat, so let me go ahead and pull those up. The first question that came in, let me see, was does the Doyle family benefit from the books? That was the first question.
That's a fantastic question because, how much time do you have? This is actually this is a movie in itself. So the Arthur Conan Doyle's family, he had children. He had a wife who died of consumption. He famously he said he wasn't having an affair with another woman for 15 years, but he was. He married her. So he had children from that relationship too. When he died, remember, he's the highest paid writer in the entire world. So his family was incredibly wealthy. So his children especially his sons, really grew up as playboys. They were very international. Adrian loved race cars and fast women and Hollywood. So they were very interested, of course, in their father's legacy. And they were very controlling about films and the different media versions. Now, growing up kind of in that lifestyle, when they inherited their father's estate, one of the sons in particular inherited the copyright, but then got divorced. And the ex-wife in the divorce agreement said, I want a piece of that copyright. So they split the copyright. And so the ex-wife got a piece of it. Then she sold it off to somebody else for money, decided later on that was a mistake, sued, tried to get that back. So the copyright itself actually has fractured. And then there's legal cases that have been going on in the last 10 years to actually, there's one in the United States in Chicago, went all the way to the Supreme Court to try to put Sherlock Holmes actually in the public domain. So the estate is quite careful in many ways and very strategic about licensing fees for anybody who wants to use a Sherlock Holmes adaptation or write an original story. So I mentioned that, Anthony Horowitz got that big old stamp that he basically was asked by the Conan Doyle estate to write the story. A lot of the other adaptations I talked about either asked and paid the Conan Doyle estate like a $5,000 licensing fee, or they wrote their own book, and then the Conan Doyle estate kind of comes after you in strategic moments. For example, right? Nancy Stringer wrote the Enola Holmes book series. Netflix decided to make the successful television, the streaming movie about it. The Arthur Conan Doyle estate waited until Netflix basically said, here's the trailer, we're going to premiere this movie. And then they said, we're going to sue you. They said, cease and desist. You have to pay us all this money or we're going to sue you. So they'd already made the film, they'd already advertised the film. And so then what happens continuously is then these places have to settle with the company. Whether or not, oftentimes the new movies and the books actually are not violating copyright because they're not using anything from the original stories that still is copyrightable, but they usually pay off the Conan Doyle estate because they don't want a legal suit. So they just keep making thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. The copyright on the stories in the United States are running out. So we have quite long copyright here. And I think there are less than 10 of the original stories that are left in American copyright. The Supreme Court just a few years ago basically said anything that's in the original stories that's not introduced for the very first time in those final stories is free and open to the public. Anybody can write about it without any kind of fear of a lawsuit. But if there's anything that's referenced in those last stories under copyright, they can't do it without the permission of the estate. So here's an example. That Ian McClellan movie, which is based on the 2006 novel A Strike to the Mind, is about Sherlock Holmes in retirement. That's him being in retirement in Sussex is only referenced in those last 10 stories. So they got sued. And so
when he was a beekeeper.
Exactly.
Right.
It's like keeping bees in Sussex.
Right.
So they sued him. So they said, you can't use that. If you talk about Watson getting remarried, you'll get sued. If you talk about Mrs. Hudson going away, you'll get sued. So there's these tiny pieces that are in those last stories. So like I said, there's some great copyright professors retired from the University of New Hampshire who have wonderful stories about literary writers and characters and copyright battles over the last 100 years. They're real fun to talk to.
Here's a question. What makes Sherlock Holmes so especially appealing to women?
Was he always? I mean, this is an interesting thing too. So on the one hand, Conan Doyle himself complained in the 1890s that Sherlock Holmes basically was too much of a sex symbol. He didn't use those words. If you read the very first story, A Study in Scarlet, he is not an appealing character. He is very tall. He's almost gaunt. He's so thin. He kind of has sunken gray eyes. He has a real hawk nose, almost like a receding hairline. But Doyle blamed that illustrator, Sidney Paget, because Sidney Paget, when he started drawing the stories for the original Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand, used his brother Walter as his model. Walter was literally a model. So he was literally a model for advertising. And so Doyle was frustrated that literally right from the very first illustrations, he said Sidney Paget drew Sherlock Holmes being way too good looking. So that kind of gets picked up in a lot of the images too. And there's some theories that, that women are attracted to really smart men. And so that we like, we're like sapiosexuals, right? We're attracted to his brain. I think the negative side of that is that he's not actually too kind. And so there's also a little, masochist, like he can be quite cruel to people. Powerful, smart, and cruel. So I think there's attraction for some people there too. Let's go back to the 1890s.
Can you explain the game to our audience? Is the next
question. Great game. So the great game comes with those Sherlockians. And so this is complicated to explain. So those Sherlockians who are part of those Sherlock Holmes societies, like the Baker Street Irregulars, when they meet together, they adopt what they call the great game, which is that they treat every detail about Sherlock Holmes as if it was historical fact. So they're playing, right? And they treat it with as the utmost seriousness that they would the Bible. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole realm and world of what I call mock scholarship, where these really knowledgeable, kind of playful Sherlock Holmes fans write theories about the Sherlock Holmes and John Watson and these stories as if they're real. And they are so believable. I was working in an archive in England in 2014, reading this article that was about this ophthalmology surgeon, that like Dr. John Watson had studied with, and all of this. It was so believable. And the whole thing was was made up, right? They'll create theories about the layout of 221B Baker Street. Whether there's one of those famous ones, what I absolutely love was like from the 40s, was Watson a woman? They said, if you look at the way, there's no way that John Watson was actually a man. He was a woman. Look at their relationship. Theories about Holmes's education, because you don't really know a lot about him. You don't get a lot of theories about that. The Baker Street Journal is a really well-known kind of literary journal full of the great game. They also, when you become a member of these, what they call them the Scion Societies, you adopt a name of one of the fictional characters, so you kind of become that character. It's just this fascinating element of the Sherlock Holmes Society, is kind of knowingly and yet tongue-in-cheek playing this game that Sherlock Holmes and John Watson were real. Arthur Conan Doyle was their literary agent. And so, right, he didn't write these stories. He's just taking credit for it.
Right. Someone is wondering if Arthur Conan Doyle wrote any nonfiction, and also did he continue practicing medicine after becoming a successful writer?
Not really. I mean, he did write nonfiction. I mean, like I said, I mentioned the 1830s. He actually wrote essays after his trip to Africa in the British photography journal with his photos and stuff, which was really fascinating, incredibly racist and really imperialist of the time. He actually gets knighted in the early 1900s because of a political book that he had written about the Boer War, which was the British fighting against the Dutch in South Africa over control of South Africa, for kind of talking about the terrible conditions the British Army was in. That's actually where the Sir comes from. He gets knighted for kind of supporting kind of the military efforts. The interesting thing about Doyle later on in his life, I mean, he wrote an autobiography as well, Memories and Adventures, is that he became really invested in spiritualism, which a lot of people know, and a lot of people don't. So in the 1900s, he believed you could talk to ghosts. He had seances. He spent a lot of money supporting mediums. He did speaking engagements and tours all over America talking about spiritualism. One of my favorite is he was good friends with Harry Houdini, and he believed Harry Houdini really could do magic. And Houdini would get so mad at him. He's like, no, I'm going to show you how I just did this trick. And Doyle said to him, if I don't know how you did it, then it must be magic. It's magic to me. So he did write and kind of really get well known, and in many ways discredited by the public, because the public couldn't rationalize this man who had created what is viewed as the most rational fictional character of all time, with a man who believed in magic and fairies and could talk to the dead. And so he had this kind of really contrasting reputation late in his life. So, but he wrote a lot. Yeah.
Is there a Sherlock Holmes grave?
That's a good one. Other than the Reichenbach Falls, I would say no. I don't think there is, because Doyle never really kills him. He never even, this is why I think the other writers love to talk about him later. Doyle himself said Sherlock Holmes could not exist after 1914. He himself was so devastated by the atrocities of World War I that he thought the world had radically changed. And so he never wrote a story of Sherlock Holmes past after 1914. Even though he continued writing till 1927 and publishing, none of those stories take place after 1914. He just couldn't reconcile in his mind Holmes's way of life and world with what happened to the world after 1914, which I think is really fascinating. But there's no grave. The closest we really have would be the big plaque at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, where he allegedly died with Professor Moriarty.
Wasn't cocaine legal in the 1880s, and what was the reaction to Holmes' addiction to it at that time?
Yes, it was not only legal, it was recommended by medical doctors. So even you go back 100 years, laudanum, which you'll see all over the place in Victorian fiction, anybody has a cough, a cold, you have a baby who won't sleep, you give them laudanum. Laudanum is alcohol infused with opium. So we had a whole generation, right, in the 19th century of people addicted to opium. Cocaine was legal and was prescribed by doctors in order to treat all different kinds of illnesses. Sigmund Freud is experimenting with cocaine in the 1870s and 80s as ways to do kind of psychotherapy and medical treatment as well. What's actually fascinating is that Arthur Conan Doyle was one of the few doctors in the 19th century who was actually arguing against narcotics use. He was very against it, and he would write, publicly about the dangers to the human body that people did not know that he thought that those drugs did. So there, in many ways, there's not really a reaction. I mean, this was kind of Holmes being a bohemian. Out of those 60 stories, I think he only is talked about using drugs 4 times. Doesn't come up, but it comes up in the second one. I mean, it's really fast as a character kind of establishing trait. What I think is unique is, rather than the public's reaction, is Watson, every time he sees him, he really chastises Holmes. He's like, why are you doing this? This is bad for your body. Why would you risk your wonderful brain by using these drugs and you don't know what the damage is going to do? So I think that's kind of one of the big differences about those stories.
And it looks like we have maybe one final question. What actor do you think portrayed Doyle's version best? And we have let's see, we have a vote for Jeremy Brett here.
I know we've got a couple of votes to Jeremy Brett, right?
Yeah, a couple of votes, yeah.
I think that's like asking a parent to choose their favorite child, right? So I will say, I fell in love with Jeremy Brett. That was my first Sherlock Holmes. He is the epitome of the Victorian Sherlock Holmes for me. I loved, he did such a prissy, arrogant Holmes that I just thought I really adored. Modern day, Benedict Cumberbatch, I'm hands down huge fan of Benedict Cumberbatch. So I like both of them.
Well, those are all the questions that we have. Thank you, Dr. Ann McClellan. Thank you, Paul Watson at Whitman Hanson Community Access. Thank you to all of you who tuned in for your questions. And I hope that you enjoyed this evening. If you enjoyed this event, please be sure to check the Whitman Public Library website for what's coming up in March. And from all of us at the library to all of you, thank you for everything. And happy reading. Take care. And
have a good evening.
Next time, friends. Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.